Waking up in a stranger's bed is a mistake. Waking up in Xavier Orsini's bed is a death sentence. But what happened next in that room is something nobody in Philadelphia saw coming, least of all Lyra Kavanagh. She was 27, a teacher who ran an adult literacy class in a church basement in Fishtown, and she worked 2 more jobs just to keep the lights on in her apartment. She'd had exactly 1 drink that night. Die. She woke at dawn in a bed that wasn't hers, in a room bigger than the whole place she rented, wearing nothing but the thin camisole she'd had on under her dress. And she wasn't alone. The man lying beside her was already awake, shirtless, propped up on one elbow, watching her the way a man watches a door he's certain he'd locked the night before. He was 37. He was Xavier Orsini, and there wasn't a bartender, a dock worker, or a detective in South Philadelphia who didn't go quiet at that name. There was a pistol resting on the mattress near his hand. He hadn't touched her. He hadn't said a single word. Lyra opened her mouth to speak, and that's when the double doors slammed open. The chandelier blazed on, and a small woman in a housecoat stopped dead in the doorway, clapped her hands together, and shouted, "Xavier, do I finally have a daughter-in-law?" Lyra waited for him to laugh, to explain, to throw her out into the street. He didn't do any of those things. What Xavier Orsini said in the next 4 seconds would follow her for the rest of her life. If this story's already got you leaning in, go ahead and hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a story that won't let go, and subscribe so the next one finds you. Now let's go back to that room at dawn. "Mother," Xavier said, "meet my fiancé." He said it in precisely the tone someone might use to recite a telephone number. No hesitation beforehand, no breath afterward. Graziella Orsini had crossed the room before Lyra could utter a single sound. She lifted Lyra's face in both hands, turned it to the left, then to the right, and let out a sound of pure approval. "Look at this face. Just look at it. This is the face of a woman who knows how to eat." She had already turned toward the door, her mouth still moving. "Bruno. Where is Bruno? Bring me the telephone." "Ma'am," Lyra began. "Call Rufo. Tell him to cancel all the flowers. Every last one, especially those white ones. They look like a funeral. I said so back in March, but no one ever listens to me." She waved a hand toward the ceiling. "Cancel the Sartori family's seating chart. Cancel Thursday's tasting. Cancel that girl's mother, too. She can stay home and spare herself the trouble. Mrs. Orsini, I think you've misunderstood. What I understand is that my son hasn't come home for Sunday dinner in 4 months." Graziella turned back, planted a forceful kiss on each of Lyra's cheeks, then gripped her firmly by the shoulders. "I don't care who you are. You're already better than the last one. 8 weeks. We have 8 weeks. I'll have someone bring up coffee." Then she was gone, the door closing behind her, and the room sank into a silence so deep it seemed to have weight. Lyra didn't move. Her heart was beating so fast she could feel it in her jaw. "What did you just do?" she asked. Xavier left the bed. He walked to the writing desk without haste, then returned carrying something wrapped in a linen cloth. He placed it on the table between them and unfolded the cloth. A glass, an ordinary drinking glass, with perhaps half a swallow still pooled at the bottom. "Do you recognize it? It's a glass. It's your glass. You set it on the windowsill beside the West Wing staircase at 11:10 last night, and you never picked it up again." He straightened. "I had someone bring it up here at 5 this morning." Lyra stared at the glass. "How do you know the exact moment I put it down?" "Because I have 11 cameras in that corridor, and I watched every recording from last night." She pulled the blanket higher and forced herself to breathe. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "I had exactly 1 drink. I know it was 1 because I counted. I don't drink when I'm working. The truth is, I hardly ever drink at all." "I believe you. Then why can't I remember how I left that corridor?" Xavier watched her for a moment. When he spoke, there was no gentleness in his voice, but there was no cruelty either. It was simply a fact, placed before her. "You weren't drunk, Miss Kavanagh. You were drugged." The words went through her like cold water. She heard herself laugh, a short, twisted sound. No, that. I was at a fundraiser. It was a scholarship dinner. There were caterers and a string quartet, and a man from the archdiocese stood up to speak about grants for literacy programs. Her hands had begun to tremble. She pressed both palms hard against her knees to make them stop. "My friend Corinne got me in. She works for the event company. She's been pushing me to network for 2 years. That's the only reason I was there. I'm nobody. I teach adults how to read in a church basement on Frankfurt Avenue. Why would anyone drug me? That's precisely the question. She reached toward the nightstand, searching for her telephone, searching for anything. I'm calling 911. No. What did you say? Go ahead and call. Xavier didn't raise his voice, nor did he move to stop her. This is what will happen. 2 police officers will come to this address. They'll take a statement from a woman who woke up in my bed with no memory of the previous 7 hours. That statement will enter the system. Within 40 minutes, 4 different people will know your name, your face, and where you work. He paused. Right now, exactly 1 person knows all 3. Give me 1 day, and I'll find out who it is. Lyra's hand remained on the telephone. She didn't pick it up. You're saying someone brought me here. I'm saying someone put you in a room they had every reason to believe would be empty. He turned toward the window. I haven't slept in this room for 3 years. I sleep on the 2nd floor. In my study, because it's the only room in the house with its own generator. The West Wing lost power at 2:40 last night. The entire wing went dark, including my study. So I came up here. He said it in a flat voice. But Lyra understood, and the realization came over her all at once, exactly as Cole did. You weren't supposed to be here, she said. No. I was supposed to be alone in this room. Yes. She sat utterly still. Somewhere below, a telephone rang, and a woman shouted at a florist in Italian, and neither sound seemed to belong to the same morning. Then what was supposed to happen to me? Xavier didn't answer. He picked up his telephone, pressed a button once, and waited. Bruno, he said. Bring it up here. The other end fell silent for a moment. Lyra heard the man's voice, dry and low, ask a single question. Yes, Xavier said. The bag under the bed. Bruno entered the room less than 2 minutes later. He didn't look at Lyra even once. He set a small gray canvas bag on the table, the kind people used to carry their workout clothes, then stepped back, stood beside the door, and folded his arms. Gloves, Xavier said. Bruno took a pair of thin plastic gloves from his coat pocket and handed them to him. Xavier put them on, unzipped the bag, and turned it upside down over the table. 2 things fell out. The first was a small object wrapped in sterile plastic, its seal still intact, something Lyra saw only briefly before she had to turn her face away. The second was a sheet of paper folded in half. Xavier didn't open it. He slid it across the table toward her. You read it first. Lyra didn't want to touch it, but she taught people how to read. And all her life, she had taught her students one thing above all else, that the most frightening thing wasn't the paper itself, but not knowing what was written on it. She unfolded it, typed words, an ordinary font, size 12, with perfectly even margins, 6 lines. She read the first line and didn't understand it. She read it again and still didn't understand. Then her eyes drifted to the bottom of the page, and there, in the lower right corner, was a name handwritten in blue ink. Lyra Kavanagh. The letters leaned at precisely the angle hers did. The Y had the backward curling tail she had written since 5th grade. The capital K sat slightly apart from the rest of the name, the same habit she had never managed to correct. She had signed that name on thousands of attendance sheets, thousands of course completion certificates, and hundreds of contract extension applications. She knew what her signature looked like, and she was looking at it. I didn't sign this, she said. Her voice sounded very far away, as though someone else were speaking for her. I've never signed this. I've never seen this paper before. I know. Then why? She set the paper on the table and drew her hand back. Why is my name on it? Xavier removed the gloves, folded them in half, and placed them beside the bag. The cameras in the West Wing corridors, he said. 11 of them. Last night, every one of them stopped recording at 12:50 and began recording again at 1:30. Exactly 40 minutes. Not 1 second earlier. Not 1 second later. He looked at her. This system didn't fail. It was shut down manually from inside the house by someone who knew the password. Lyra sat motionless. She stared at the paper on the table, at her own name, and something began to come together inside her mind, slowly and cruelly. Say it, she said. Say it out loud. I'd rather hear you say it than imagine it myself. Xavier pulled out the chair and sat across from her, and for the first time that morning, the distance between them grew smaller. This morning, the servants were supposed to find you in this room, he said, alone. This paper would be on the table with your signature on it. That other thing would be in your bag. The police would come. They would find a woman of 27, unmarried, with no children, working 3 jobs, carrying the debt from her mother's hospital bills, and with the exact drug in her blood that people are told is supposed to help them sleep. They would close the case in 4 days. Lyra felt both of her hands turn cold. But it would have happened in my house, Xavier continued. In my bedroom. And I don't have the kind of name the press ignores. By noon, the story would be on the front page of the Inquirer. By afternoon, 3 television stations would have their trucks parked outside the gates. By the following week, the federal prosecutor's office would have enough cause to reopen everything they've closed over the past 5 years. And this time, they would have public opinion behind them. He paused. Not a single bullet would be fired. No one would have to show their face. This entire family would collapse because of 1 sheet of A4 paper. Lyra raised her head. But why me? You don't know me. I don't know you. I had never set foot in this house before last night. Exactly, Xavier said. And that is precisely why. She waited. To stage this, they needed a woman with no connection whatsoever to my world. No one who could be cross-checked. No lawyer making telephone calls. No family standing outside the gates demanding answers. No co-workers going on television to say that none of it made sense. He spoke the next sentence without lowering his voice, with nothing added before it and nothing after. They chose you because you're the kind of person no one goes looking for. Lyra didn't respond at once. She looked down at her hands, then at the paper, then out the window, where morning had fully broken. Bruno still stood silently beside the door. For a long while, no one in the room said anything more. Then Lyra asked very softly, "That thing in the bag, if you hadn't come up here last night, would I still be alive now?" Xavier didn't answer, and the fact that he didn't answer was the answer. That silence lasted longer than Lyra had expected. Then she spoke, and her voice no longer trembled. "You're right." Xavier looked up. "No one will come looking for me." She said it in the same tone someone might use to read a weather forecast. "I don't have any brothers or sisters. My father died when I was 19. My mother is in a memory care facility in Roxborough, and she can't remember who I am. I rent a 3rd-floor apartment on Kensington Avenue, and my landlady only calls me on the 1st of every month. My classes meet 3 times a week, on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. If I don't show up, they'll assume I'm sick. By the 2nd week, they'll assume I quit. No one will call the police." She looked down at the paper on the table. "The only person who might notice I was missing within 48 hours is Corinne, and she's the one who brought me here last night." Bruno shifted 1 foot slightly beside the door. Xavier didn't look at him. "Are you finished?" he asked. "Yes." "Then listen to me." He pushed the glass aside so that nothing remained between them. "You were right until this morning. As of this morning, someone will come looking for you." Lyra raised her eyes. "You don't know me." "No. Then why do you care?" "I didn't say I cared," Xavier replied. "I said that from now on, if you disappear, someone will ask why. Those are 2 different things, and the second is what you need." She had no answer to that. He rose, walked to the window, and stood with his back to her. "I'll tell you why someone wants to see me broken this month," he said. 8 weeks from now, I'm supposed to marry a woman named Bianca Sartori. Her father and mine divided the southern docks between them for 20 years, and for the past 10 years, the 2 sides have maintained the peace with nothing more than empty promises. That marriage is the only thing that turns those promises into a binding agreement. Without it, everything falls apart within a season. He turned around, and the 4 words I said to my mother this morning tore it to pieces. Lyra sat up straighter. "Did you know what you were doing when you said that?" "I did." "Then why did you say it?" "Because when my mother opened that door, I had 4 seconds, Xavier said. In those 4 seconds, I had 2 choices. The first was to let her see a strange woman in my room and tell 30 people about it herself at Sunday dinner. By Monday, the entire city would know that a teacher had spent the night in my house, and whoever planted that bag would know their plan had failed, and they would come looking for you to clean up what was left." He paused. "The second was to tell her you were my fiancé. Then you were no longer a mistake. You were a decision, and no one dares clean up a decision I've made." Lyra clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "You just used me to destroy a treaty." "I just used you to keep you breathing," Xavier said. "That treaty was already broken. You merely happened to be on the table at the right moment." She stood, pulling the blanket around her, and took 2 steps into the middle of the room. She needed to stand. She needed to feel the floor beneath her feet. "What happens now?" she asked. I go home, don't I? You have someone drive me back to Kensington. I take a shower. I work the afternoon shift at the bookstore. I go to class Tuesday night, and we forget any of this ever happened? Xavier looked at her for a long time. Do you want the truthful answer, or the comforting one? I teach adults how to read, Lyra said. I've never told anyone a comforting lie in my life. He gave the slightest nod, as though she had just answered a question he hadn't yet asked. If I send you back to your apartment today, he said, you'll live for 48 hours. The entire room fell silent. Bruno still didn't move. Footsteps passed through the hallway outside, then faded away. 48 hours, Lyra repeated, possibly less. You saw the paper. You know that bag exists. As of this morning, you're living evidence of something that was never supposed to leave any evidence behind. He picked up the paper, folded it along its original crease, and slipped it into his coat pocket. They don't need you dead because of me. They need you dead because you saw it. Lyra stood there, gripping the edge of the blanket, thinking about her Tuesday night class, about the 32 names in her attendance book, about her mother sitting beside a window in Roxborough, unable to remember what day it was. Then she asked the only question left to ask. What do you want from me? Outside the window, the outlines of the trees in Chestnut Hill had become clear. Xavier rose, poured water from the glass pitcher on the table into a cup, and set it down in front of Lyra. She didn't touch it. I want you to play exactly the role my mother just gave you, he said, then sat in the chair across from her. You're my fiancé. You stay in this house. You appear wherever I tell you to appear. The more people see you standing beside me, the more useless that bag becomes. He allowed a silence to settle before continuing, his voice as flat as if he were reading the terms of a contract. In return, I'll cover every expense for your mother, Roxborough, or anywhere better. Every old debt, every bill that comes afterward. As long as she lives, you'll never have to look at another bill again. Lyra didn't answer immediately. She pulled the blanket higher around her shoulders, stood, and walked to the window. She remained there long enough for Bruno, standing beside the door, to shift his weight from one foot to the other. When she turned back, she didn't sit down. No, she said. Xavier looked up. What did you just say? I said no. Don't pay my mother's medical bills. How much do you owe them? That isn't relevant. He waited. Lyra understood that he would wait until the morning was over if necessary, so she gave him the number, 18,400, another 8,200 next month. She sat down, placed both hands on the table, and spread all 10 fingers. I know that number by heart. I recite it every morning before I brush my teeth. Xavier said nothing. If you pay it, I'm no longer someone you hired, she said. I become someone you bought, and once I've sold myself, I'll have nothing left to stand on when I speak to you. She looked down at her hands. Her nails were cut short, the nails of someone who had to write on a board and wipe it clean every evening. I teach 32 adults how to read. The youngest is 24. The oldest is 63. Every one of them comes to class because at some point they accepted something from someone, and after that, they no longer dared to speak up. She raised her eyes. I don't teach them letters. I teach them how to sit up straight in a room with someone more powerful than they are. If I take your money this morning, I won't be able to stand in front of my class Tuesday night. The room fell silent. Bruno glanced at his employer once, then lowered his gaze to the floor. Xavier sat motionless, his hands resting loosely on his thighs. He had sat in hundreds of rooms with people who bargained with him, begged him, and threatened him. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had refused his money. For the span of a single breath, he had no answer ready. Then he leaned forward. Then tell me what you want. It wasn't a question. It was almost an admission. Lyra pulled the cup of water closer, took a sip, then set it down. I have 3 conditions. Go on. First, 3 months. Not 6. Not a year. Not until you've finished dealing with your problems. 3 months from today. She tapped one fingertip against the table once. Your mother just said the wedding would be in 8 weeks. 8 weeks fits comfortably inside 3 months. After that, this ends. Second, I keep teaching. Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday nights. Xavier frowned. He stood, walked 2 steps toward the window, then turned back to look at her. You understand that you're asking me to let you leave this house 3 times a week, go out into the city at a fixed time and to a fixed place, while someone has just tried to arrange your death? I understand. Then why? Because if I abandon that class, Those 32 people will think I'm just like everyone else who abandoned them before." She gave the slightest shrug. "I'd rather take the risk than let them believe that." He didn't answer. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, studying her as though she were a contract written in a language he had never learned. "My third condition," she said. "You don't lie to me. This time," he truly stopped. "You don't have to tell me everything. I'm not asking to know about your business, but anything you do tell me must be true." She pushed the cup toward the center of the table. "I can endure the truth. I can't endure being led somewhere without knowing where I'm going." Xavier walked to the writing desk. He opened a drawer, took out a small card, returned, and placed it in front of her. "This is Bruno's number. If anything happens, press it once." He looked down at her. "I agree to all three." Lyra picked up the card. She didn't know when her hands had stopped trembling. She rose, wrapped the blanket more securely around herself, and walked toward the door. When she reached it, she stopped. 3 months, she said. "Then I disappear from your life." Xavier had already turned half a step away. He stopped, turned his head, and looked at her over his shoulder. "No one disappears from my life, Miss Kavanagh." The car stopped in front of the building on Kensington Avenue at nearly 11 o'clock in the morning. Bruno turned off the engine, but he didn't get out right away. He sat motionless for more than a minute, staring through the windshield, before finally opening the door. "Stay behind me," he said. Lyra followed him up 3 flights of stairs. When they reached the 3rd-floor landing, Bruno raised a hand, signaling for her to stop. The apartment door stood slightly ajar. There were no signs that it had been forced, no splintered wood on the frame, nothing at all. It simply wasn't closed. Bruno pushed it open with the back of his hand and entered first. Inside, everything had been turned upside down. Drawers had been pulled open and left that way. Books had fallen from the shelves and lay face down on the floor. The mattress had been lifted and propped against the wall. It didn't look like a hurried burglary. It looked like a methodical search conducted by someone who had plenty of time and no fear that anyone might hear. Lyra stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside. She didn't pick anything up. She went straight to the top kitchen drawer, opened it, and reached behind it. She pulled out a brown envelope and opened it. Inside were 7 $100 bills and several 20s. She counted them once with her thumb, then returned the envelope to its hiding place. She walked into the living room. Her laptop was beneath the table, untouched, its charging cable still plugged into the outlet. She bent down, touched it, then stood again. In the bedroom, she turned over the tin box of paper clips that lay on its side on the floor. Her mother's wedding ring rolled out. It was still there, its gold worn dull with age. Lyra picked it up, slipped it onto her little finger, and straightened. "They didn't take anything," Bruno said. He stood in the middle of the living room, with his hands in his coat pockets, his eyes sweeping over every corner of the room. "Yes, they did." Lyra walked to the desk beside the window. It had been pulled about 8 inches away from the wall. She stared at its surface for a long time. "2 things." Bruno moved closer. "What things?" She pointed to a rectangular space on the wood, where an outline remained in the thin layer of dust. "There was a picture frame here. A photograph of my mother and me at Penn's Landing in the summer of 2022. It was the last picture taken before she stopped understanding that someone was taking her picture." She opened the bottom drawer, the only one that had been pushed neatly back into place. "And there was a file in here. My mother's entire medical record. Scan results, prescriptions, hospital referrals, every bill from the past 4 years. I kept paper copies because I had to carry them with me every time we changed doctors." The drawer was empty. Bruno said nothing. He took out his telephone but didn't press anything yet. Lyra remained there, staring into that empty drawer. In her mind, everything began fitting together in an order she didn't want it to follow. The money was untouched. The laptop was untouched. Her mother's ring, the only thing in the apartment worth more than $100, was untouched. Whoever had come in here didn't need money. Whoever had come in here had been searching for something else, and once they found it, they took that one thing and nothing more. "Tell me," Bruno said. "What was in that file?" Lyra didn't turn around. The name of the facility, the address, her room number, the name of her doctor, the name of the head nurse, visiting hours, her insurance identification number, her date of birth, her social security number. She heard her own voice coming out perfectly calm, and that was what frightened her most. There was also a notice they sent last month saying that if payment remained overdue for more than 30 days, they would have no choice but to discharge her. Bruno made the call. He spoke 3 short sentences in a voice so low that Lyra couldn't make out the words, then hung up. "We're leaving," he said. Lyra didn't move. She reached out and touched the rectangular space on the desk, where the dust still held the outline of the picture frame, then drew her hand back. "There are 6 apartments in this building," she said. 4 of them have newer televisions than mine. The people on the first floor leave an expensive bicycle in the hallway without a lock. If this had been a burglary, they would have gone in there. Miss Kavanagh, they took a photograph and a file of medical records," she said. "Only those 2 things. They couldn't sell either one for a single dollar." She turned to face Bruno, and in that moment, he saw her expression change. Not the way a person's face changed in panic, but the way it changed when someone had finished reading a sentence and finally understood what it meant. She had spent 4 years teaching people to read. She knew what that realization looked like on someone else's face. Now it was happening to her. She walked to the door, stopped, and spoke one final sentence before descending the stairs. "They know where my mother is. They moved Maeve Kavanagh at 10:40 that night. Xavier wouldn't allow them to wait until morning. The new facility was in Bryn Mawr, 20 minutes from Roxborough, in a low building with no sign facing the street. Bruno handled the paperwork. 2 other men stood at opposite ends of the second-floor hallway, and neither of them sat down the entire evening. Lyra walked beside the wheelchair along the final stretch of the corridor. Her mother wore a button-front cardigan and held a cloth bag in her arms that she had refused to let go of throughout the journey. Inside the room, the nurse positioned the bed beside the window, then quietly withdrew. Lyra pulled up a chair, sat beside the bed, and took her mother's hand. "I'm here, Mom." Maeve studied her for a long moment. "You're the teacher, aren't you?" Lyra didn't correct her. "Yes, I knew it. You sit like someone who teaches. Back straight." Maeve nodded thoughtfully. "What class do you teach?" "Evening classes. Adults. What is left for adults to learn? How to read." "Ah." Maeve looked out the window. "That's good. Knowing how to read makes life less difficult." She fell silent for a while, then turned back. "Have you met my daughter? Her name is Lyra." "Yes, I have." "How is she?" Lyra gently tightened her hand around her mother's. That hand was thinner than she remembered. "She's doing well." "Has she lost weight?" "She's always forgetting to eat. She's been that way since she was little. Once she sits down to study, she forgets everything else." "I'll remind her. Please remind her for me." Maeve nodded, satisfied. "She works 3 jobs. 3 jobs, can you imagine? I told her to give one of them up, but she wouldn't listen." Her brow furrowed. "Did she come today?" "She'll probably come tomorrow." "Tomorrow." Maeve looked down at the cloth bag in her lap. "Tell her not to buy me anything. She keeps bringing things, and then she wastes her money." Outside in the hallway, Xavier had been standing there for some time. He didn't enter the room. He didn't knock. He stood about 4 steps beyond the open doorway, both hands in his coat pockets, and he heard everything. Bruno was about to say something, but Xavier raised 2 fingers very slightly, and Bruno fell silent. Inside the room, Maeve was telling a story about something that had happened in 1998, about how her husband had repaired the porch roof the wrong way, and rain had leaked through it for 3 months, and she laughed. Lyra laughed with her. She laughed, then heard her own laughter break in the middle, and she bit the inside of her lip to keep it from breaking again. "Teacher." "Yes? Are you staying here? I'll sit with you a little longer. It's late. You should go home before your husband and children start waiting for you." "I don't have anyone waiting for me." Maeve gently patted the back of her hand. "You will. You're still young." She lowered her head onto the pillow. "Remember to tell my daughter I'm doing well. Don't let her worry. She worries too much." Lyra sat without moving until her mother fell asleep. Then she pulled the blanket up to Maeve's shoulders, rose, and stepped into the hallway. Xavier had moved farther away from the door. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He simply removed his overcoat and held it out to her. Lyra accepted it. She put it on, folded her arms across her chest, and leaned against the wall for a long while without speaking. Half an hour later, Bruno came upstairs carrying a document case. "The former facility sent the records over," he said. "They're backup copies. The originals are gone." Lyra sat on the row of chairs in the hallway and opened it. She leafed through the magnetic resonance scans, prescriptions, and cognitive assessment reports. Then she reached the billing section and stopped. The notice from the previous month was still there. 30 days. If payment wasn't received by the deadline, the facility would be forced to terminate care, and the family would have to arrange other accommodations. The date it was signed, the date it was sent, the signature of the finance director. She had read that notice 3 times over the past month, but behind it was another sheet she had never seen. A payment receipt. The entire outstanding balance, $18,400, had been paid in full, not in installments, not partially, cleared. Lyra looked at the date column, then she looked again. Then she handed the paper to Xavier. "Look at this." He took it, read it, and his expression didn't change. 2 days before the party, Lyra said, "Someone paid my mother's entire bill 2 days before the night I woke up in your house." She stood. "It wasn't me. It wasn't the insurance company. They left the payer's name blank." Xavier folded the paper. "Then they didn't merely choose you," he said. "They also kept your mother in exactly the right place, to make certain she couldn't go anywhere. On Tuesday night, the church basement on Frankfurt Avenue opened at 7 o'clock, just as it did every week. Lyra arrived half an hour early, rearranged the tables and chairs into a U shape, and placed an old recorder at the corner of the first table. She pressed the record button, checked the red light, and left it there. "It's for Doreen," she said when one of the students glanced over. "Her eyesight failed last year. I record the lessons and send her the files so she can listen." Bruno sat on the bottom step near the door and kept his coat on. Xavier arrived at 7:10. He didn't speak to anyone. He went straight to the last row, sat in a blue plastic chair against the wall, and didn't rise again for the next 2 hours. 26 people came to class that night. The youngest was a 24-year-old nail technician. The oldest sat in the front row beside the teacher's table, a broad-shouldered man of 63 with hands as large as a bear's paws and thick fingernails. Walt Grady had worked as a longshoreman at the Delaware docks for 31 years. He had retired in 2019 because of his back. He had never read a complete sentence in his life. During the first half of the class, Lyra taught them how to search public records. She handed each person an application for a library card. "This is free," she said. "With this card, you can access the digital archives of the Free Library of Philadelphia. They have old newspapers, court records, property documents, and city records. People often think you need a lawyer to see those things. You don't. They belong to the public. Everyone has the right to look them up. Someone asked what they would need to search for, so no one can take advantage of you," Lyra said. "People can lie to someone who doesn't know where to look." Shortly before 9 o'clock, she placed a sheet of paper in front of Walt. It held a single sentence, 9 words printed in large type. The entire class fell silent. Walt placed both hands on the edge of the table. "Take your time," Lyra said. He stared down at the paper for a long while. He exhaled through his nose. The first word came out dry and rough. The second came more slowly, drawn out over several seconds. At the 4th word, he stopped, and the entire room seemed to stop with him. Lyra didn't prompt him. She stood 1 step away from his table, her hands perfectly still. Walt began again from the beginning. This time, he made it all the way through. 9 words, without stumbling, without asking anyone for help. When he finished the final word, he didn't look up right away. He sat motionless, staring at the sheet of paper, and those immense shoulders began to tremble. The woman beside him reached out and placed a hand on his back. "For 31 years, I signed my name with an X," Walt said. His voice broke in the middle. 31 years. People handed me papers, I signed an X, and then I laughed it off. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. I'm sorry, teacher." "You don't owe anyone an apology," Lyra said. The whole class applauded. No one had to tell them to. Someone whistled. The young nail technician rose all the way to her feet. Walt smiled, wiped his face again, then folded the paper into quarters and slipped it into the breast pocket of his shirt. In the last row, Xavier remained still. He didn't applaud. He didn't say anything. But he had straightened in his chair when Walt began reading for the second time, and he held that posture until the last of the applause had faded away. At 9:10, the class ended. Lyra switched off the recorder, tucked it into her bag, and began gathering the markers from the board. Walt approached her before leaving. "I'll come early on Thursday," he said. "I want to practice that sentence again." "Of course, teacher." He hesitated. "Can I take one of those library card applications? I'd like another one for my brother-in-law." She gave him 3. After everyone had gone, Xavier rose, walked between the rows of chairs, and stopped beside the door. He said nothing about the lesson. He only said, "The car is waiting outside." Lyra slipped her bag over her shoulder and followed him up the stairs. When they reached the sidewalk, wind from the river swept along Frankfurt Avenue, and she raised her collar against it. Bruno walked ahead and opened the car door. Lyra stepped off the curb, then stopped. Across the street, beneath the awning of a closed store, a man stood with his telephone aimed at the church building, not at them. At the basement door where 26 people had just emerged, he took 3 photographs, lowered the telephone, and stepped backward into the shadows of the alley beside him. Lyra stood motionless in the middle of the street. "Get in the car," Xavier said. The car left the hotel at 10:20. Bruno turned. Ahead of them, a small truck was parked across 2 lanes, its hazard lights flashing, with no one inside the cab. Bruno didn't brake suddenly. He brought the car to a stop about 50 feet away and placed one hand on the gearshift. "Lock the doors," Xavier said. Bruno locked them. No one inside the car spoke. Lyra looked through the windshield and saw 2 figures step away from the sidewalk on the right. They moved very slowly. Neither of them carried anything in his hands. The man in front approached the window beside the driver's seat, bent down, and held up a white envelope. He didn't knock on the glass. He simply pressed the envelope against it, held it there for 3 seconds, then lowered his hand and laid it flat on the hood. Then both men turned, walked back to the truck, climbed inside, and drove it out of the road. The entire thing took less than 40 seconds. Bruno opened the door, stepped out, picked up the envelope between 2 fingers, then returned to his seat and passed it into the back. Xavier took it, tore open one edge, and pulled something out. It was a photograph. It had been printed on ordinary paper, about the size of a sheet of writing paper. It had been taken from across the street, through the street-level window of the church basement on Frankfurt Avenue. In the photograph, Lyra stood with her body turned slightly sideways, one hand pointing at the sheet of paper in front of Walt Grady. Walt's head was lowered as he read. Behind them, the faces of at least 8 people in the second row were clearly visible. The photograph had been taken Tuesday night. Along the bottom edge, one line had been handwritten in blue ink. 32 students. Choose one. Lyra took the photograph. She said nothing for a long while. She studied every face in the image, one by one, from left to right, exactly the way she took attendance every evening. "They even counted the names in my attendance book," she said. The car began moving again. Bruno didn't take the same route. He turned onto a narrow side street and circled around without anyone telling him to do it. 32. Lyra continued. Only 26 people came to Tuesday night's class. 32 is the total number enrolled this semester. That number is in my attendance book, and there's a copy in the parish office. She lowered the photograph onto her lap. That means they didn't merely stand outside and take pictures one night. They went all the way inside. Xavier didn't answer. He was looking out the window, and as the streetlights swept across his face, his expression never changed. The car continued for several minutes. Then Lyra spoke in a perfectly calm voice. "I'm quitting the class." Xavier turned his head toward her. "I'm quitting," she repeated. "Tomorrow, I'll call the priest. I'll tell him I have a family matter. I'll ask them to find someone to replace me for 3 months. The class will remain open. It'll just have a different teacher." The words came in one unbroken stream, without a stumble, as though she had arranged everything in her mind from the moment she saw the photograph. "I can't drag 32 people into your troubles. You think quitting will keep them safe? I think if I stop going there, they'll have no reason to go there anymore." "You're wrong." Xavier lifted the photograph from her lap, turned it over, and placed it on the seat between them. "Read the message again." Lyra didn't look down. She had already memorized it. "They didn't write that they'll act if you keep teaching," Xavier said. "They didn't give you any condition at all. They only showed you that they can count them. They can get inside, and they can choose one. Whether you quit or not, all 3 of those things remain true." He paused. "What they want isn't for you to leave that basement. What they want is for you to sit in this car and say exactly what you just said." Lyra clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "Then what am I supposed to do? Go to class as though nothing happened? Stand in front of 26 people knowing that someone has photographed every one of their faces? I'm not telling you to pretend nothing happened." Xavier looked at her. "I'm telling you that if you walk away, they win without spending a single bullet." The car turned onto the main road. The lights of a gas station swept across the ceiling of the car and disappeared. "You told me that you teach those people how to sit with their backs straight in a room where someone else holds more power than they do." Xavier said. You did that tonight at the Bellevue. Now someone sends you a photograph, and within 10 minutes, you've already arranged your retreat, written your excuse, and found your replacement. He pushed the photograph toward her. How do you think those 32 people will understand that? Lyra looked down at the photograph on the seat. Walt Grady was still sitting there with his head bowed, his enormous hands resting on the edge of the table, and she remembered that in this picture, he was reading the sentence for the second time. I'll still teach on Thursday, she said. But you have to put someone inside the room. Not outside. Inside. Xavier nodded once. All right. On Thursday night, Bruno and 2 other men went down to the church basement at 6:45 and sat in the back row. They wore dark coats, and they didn't take them off. Lyra stood at the board, turned to look at the 3 enormous men sitting as still as statues in a room that smelled of coffee and photocopied paper, then walked over and placed a worksheet in front of each of them. If you're going to sit here, you'll do the work like everyone else, she said. Bruno looked at the paper. You're serious? Every adult in this room is trying to learn something they don't know. If the 3 of you sit there with your arms folded, they'll think they're being watched. She handed him a pencil. Fill in the blanks. There are 10 questions. The man beside Bruno let out a laugh, then fell abruptly silent when Bruno glanced at him. By 9 o'clock, all 3 men had finished. Bruno got 2 answers wrong. Walt Grady walked past, glanced down at his paper, and gave him a pat on the shoulder. You need 2 ends here, son, Walt said. I made the same mistake last week. Bruno nodded, corrected it, and said nothing more. On Saturday morning, Graziella came to Lyra's room at 9 o'clock. She didn't knock. She opened the door, looked around once, then said, Put on your coat. The car is waiting. Where are we going, ma'am? To try on clothes. The shop was on Walnut Street, on the 2nd floor, with no sign outside. The tailor brought out 3 outfits. Lyra put on the first, stepped out, and stood before a 3-way mirror. She remained there for about 10 seconds. Then she drew her shoulders in slightly and tugged the sleeves down to cover her wrists. Graziella was seated in an armchair in the corner. She set down her coffee cup. Stop. Lyra turned her head. Not the outfit, Graziella said. The outfit is fine. Stop doing that with your shoulders. She rose, walked up behind Lyra, and placed both hands on her shoulder blades. You're standing like someone apologizing. Lyra said nothing. I've been watching you all week, Graziella said. When you walk through the hallway, you stay close to the wall. When you sit at the dining table, you pull your chair out less than everyone else. Last night, someone carried a plate past your face, and you said thank you twice. She gently pressed Lyra's shoulders down. Stand straight. Don't push out your chest. Just stop making yourself smaller. Lyra relaxed her shoulders. In the mirror, she seemed nearly an inch taller than she had a moment before. You don't need to look more beautiful, Graziella said. You need to stop apologizing for existing. She turned away, sat down again, and picked up her coffee cup. People don't look at the clothes. They look to see whether you believe you're allowed to be in the room. If you don't believe it, neither will they. Lyra continued staring into the mirror. Where did you learn that, ma'am? I didn't. I had to figure it out for myself. Graziella took a sip. I married at 22. Before that, I was a nurse. Lyra turned all the way around. You were a nurse? For 9 years. St. Agnes Hospital, on the south side of the city. I worked the night shift in the emergency department. She said it in the same tone someone might use to mention that they had once lived on a certain street. I left after I had Tobia. She set the cup on its saucer. No one in this family has mentioned it in 30 years. They grew up, and all they know is that I'm the one who cooks Sunday dinner. You never told them again? What would be the point? Once people have decided who you are, it makes no difference what you tell them. Graziella shrugged. Besides, the training is useful. I still use it. How? She looked at Lyra for a moment, then smiled and changed the subject. Nurses look at people longer than most. It becomes a habit. A person says one thing, but their face says something else, so you have to watch the face. I've done it for too long to stop now. She pointed toward the mirror. For example, just now, you thought of something painful, and you raised your hand to touch your left wrist. You've done that 3 times since this morning. Lyra looked down at her hand. It was resting exactly where Graziella had said. I'm not asking, Graziella said. I'm only letting you know that you do it. The tailor returned with the second outfit. Lyra went inside to change. When she stepped out, she didn't tug her sleeves down again, and she stood straight. and Graziella said nothing at all. She merely nodded once, then turned to the tailor and told him to alter the line of the shoulders. In the car on the way home, the two women sat in silence for a while. Then Lyra asked, "Ma'am, do you believe there'll be a wedding in 8 weeks?" Graziella looked out the window. "I believe something will happen in 8 weeks, she said. "Whether it'll be a wedding, I don't yet know." Near midnight that night, Lyra went downstairs to find some water. A light was still burning in the study at the end of the hall. Xavier sat behind the desk with his shirt sleeves rolled up, a stack of papers before him that he wasn't reading. She meant to walk past, but stopped in the doorway. "You're not sleeping?" "Not yet." He pushed out the chair across from him with the toe of his shoe. "Sit down." She sat. On the wall behind him hung a framed black and white photograph of a group of people standing before a row of cranes at the docks. Lyra had passed through this room 4 times in 2 weeks, and she'd never noticed it before. She studied it longer than necessary. "The second man from the left," Xavier said. "That was my brother." Lyra turned back toward him. He didn't look up at the photograph. He was turning a pen between 2 fingers. "His name was Tobia," he said. "He was 6 years older than me. He died on August 14th, 2008. He was 25. He set the pen down. "There was an explosion at warehouse number 7 at the Delaware docks at 4:10 in the morning. The official cause was listed as a leaking gas line, combined with an outdated electrical system. The fire department ruled it an accident. The police department didn't open a criminal investigation. The case was closed after 41 days. He delivered the entire account, in the voice of a man reciting a document he had committed to memory. He didn't speak faster or slower at any point." Lyra remained silent. "He was supposed to be the successor," Xavier continued. "Everyone knew it. He'd followed my father since he was 16. He knew the name of every man who worked at the docks, knew who owed what to whom, knew what to say to each person. He could sit down to lunch with a man who wanted to kill him, and they would both stand up from the table, still smiling." He picked up the pen, then put it down again. "I was in my 2nd year at Temple University. Accounting. I was going to become an auditor." Lyra couldn't stop herself. "You were going to become an auditor?" "I like things that add up exactly," Xavier said. "The funeral was on Saturday. The following Monday, my father called me into this room, this exact room, and sat in the same chair you're sitting in now. He said 3 sentences to me. Then he called in 4 men, and all 4 of them shook my hand." He looked down at the surface of the desk. 1 week. From the moment my brother died to the moment I took this seat. 1 week. Lyra didn't ask what those 3 sentences had been. She sat quietly and listened to the clock in the hall. "Do you believe it was an accident?" she asked. Xavier looked up. "I haven't said this to anyone in 18 years. "Then don't say it to me." "No." He shook his head once. "You made it a condition that I wouldn't lie to you. So here it is." He rested both elbows on the desk. "No, I don't believe it. Do you have any evidence?" "Nothing at all. That's the problem," he continued, still in that same flat voice. "I've had people review it 3 times in 18 years. All 3 times, they reached the same conclusion. The gas line really was old. The electrical system really was old. No outsider entered the docks that night. No one benefited in any obvious way. The Sartori family was losing then. They weren't strong enough to do something like that, and if they had done it, they would have taken advantage of it the following week. They did nothing." He gave the faintest shrug. "Everything makes sense, and I still don't believe it. I can't explain why." Lyra leaned forward. "Have you ever considered that whoever did it wasn't meant to benefit right away?" Xavier raised his eyes to her. "What do you mean?" "I teach people how to search records," she said. "The first lesson is, don't look for the person who benefits the following month. Look for the person who benefits in the 10th year." She pointed toward the photograph on the wall. "Your brother was 25, knew everything, and had everyone's respect. You were 19, studying accounting, and knew nothing. If I wanted your family's seat but couldn't sit in it myself, I wouldn't kill the man sitting in that chair. I would replace him with a boy I could guide." The room fell silent. Xavier sat perfectly still. He didn't answer at once, and Lyra saw something change in his face, something very small around his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak. The telephone on the desk began to vibrate. He glanced at the screen and answered immediately. "Talk." Lyra could hear Bruno's voice from the other end, but she couldn't make out the words. She watched Xavier rise from his chair. "When?" he asked. A pause followed. What did he say? Another silence. Xavier placed one hand flat on the desk. He asked where Mrs. Kavanagh's room was. Lyra sprang to her feet. The man who came to the hospital in Bryn Mawr that night didn't get past the reception desk. He said he worked for an insurance company and asked for Mrs. Kavanagh's room number. But when the woman on duty asked to see his identification, he thanked her and left. The cameras captured his face for 3 seconds. Bruno had men guarding both entrances from that night onward. 3 days passed, without anything else happening. On Tuesday morning, Lyra's phone vibrated. Corinne was calling. Corinne began crying with her very first words. Crying the way people cry when they've already been crying for a long time before they finally press the call button. And she asked only to meet in private, for 15 minutes, anywhere at all. As long as Lyra came alone. Bruno objected. Xavier listened to the entire call, then told him to drive her there and wait outside. The coffee shop stood at the corner of 2nd Street and Poplar Street, the narrow, deep kind of place where only 3 tables were occupied that morning. Corinne sat at the table farthest inside, with her back to the door. Before her sat a cup of coffee that had gone completely cold. Untouched, Lyra pulled out the chair and sat across from her. She had spent the entire drive preparing 3 questions in her mind, but she didn't get the chance to ask any of them. Corinne spoke first. I put the drug in your drink. Lyra didn't move. Corinne raised both hands and covered her face, holding them there for a moment before lowering them again. She didn't wipe away her tears. She continued quickly, her voice so even that it sounded as though she were reading from a statement she had already written. Perry owed money. It wasn't a few thousand in gambling debts like the year before. It was $240,000, accumulated over 14 months. And the men holding the note worked for the Sartori family. They first approached her in April. They didn't threaten her. They simply sat down, told her the amount, and offered her a task. Lyra remained silent. Corinne said they hadn't chosen her because she mattered. They had chosen her because the event planning company she worked for was handling this year's scholarship gala, and because she had a close friend. They made it clear that they needed a woman with no connection to that world. Someone no one would question. They said it wouldn't hurt. They said all she had to do was bring that friend to the party, pour her a drink, and leave early. Lyra remained still. She placed both hands in her lap beneath the table, where Corinne couldn't see them. Corinne said she had refused twice. The 3rd time, they gave her a sheet of paper. On it were the name of the Roxborough facility, Maeve Kavanagh's room number, and a copy of the 30-day notice. They said that if Corinne didn't do it, the elderly woman would be discharged the following month, and everyone knew Lyra had no way of finding $18,400. Then they added that if Corinne did it, they would pay the entire amount. For the first time, Corinne stopped. She looked down at the cold coffee. I'm the one who paid it, she said. It was their money, but I'm the one who signed the paperwork. I went all the way to the finance desk. I filled out the receipt, and I left the payer field blank. Lyra said nothing. In her mind, she could see that receipt with perfect clarity. The sheet of paper she had held in the hallway of the Bryn Mawr Hospital, the figure of $18,400, the date column, 2 days before the gala. I kept telling myself that at least your aunt could stay, Corinne said. I repeated that to myself over and over, for 2 weeks. She looked up, but it wasn't meant to save your aunt. It was meant to keep her lying still in one place, to make sure you had no reason to move her, so they would know exactly which room she was in. The sound of a coffee grinder came from the counter. A customer rose and walked out, and the glass door closed behind him. Corinne waited for Lyra to say something. Lyra said nothing. She sat with her back straight, her hands beneath the table, and stared at the woman across from her with the eyes of someone trying to read a line of words in light too dim to see by. 10 years. Corinne had sat beside her in the hospital corridor the night her father died. Corinne was the only person who knew the password to her phone. The silence lasted long enough for Corinne to begin trembling. Say something, she said. Lyra still said nothing. Corinne pushed the coffee cup aside, and the tears began flowing again. And this time she finally said the thing she had been avoiding from the moment Lyra sat down. I didn't choose you because you were the easiest person to deceive. She drew in a breath. They told me to choose someone. Anyone. Corinne finished the sentence in a voice so soft it was almost soundless. She said they had told her to choose one person, anyone at all. And she had sat in her car for 3 hours, scrolling through every name in her phone from beginning to end, twice. There were 4 names that made her stop. Then she crossed them off one by one. The first had a husband who worked at the courthouse. The second had 3 brothers. The third posted pictures online 4 times a day and had 800 followers. When she reached the 4th name, she couldn't find a single reason to cross it off. Corinne raised her eyes and said she had chosen Lyra because Lyra was the only person she knew whose disappearance wouldn't cause anyone to make a fuss. Lyra remained seated for another moment. Then she stood. She didn't shove back the chair. She pushed it neatly against the table, exactly as she always did in the classroom when the evening ended, then walked toward the door. Corinne called her name twice. She didn't turn around. Bruno was standing beside the car at the corner. He opened the door. Lyra slid into the back seat, pulled the door shut, and sat with her back straight, staring through the window. Bruno watched her in the rearview mirror and waited, then started the engine. The car traveled the length of Poplar Street, turned right, and merged into the midday traffic. Lyra remained silent for 4 blocks. She sat the way people sit when they're still holding themselves together, when the body still obeys, when thoughts still move in orderly lines. During those 4 blocks, she thought about whom she needed to call, what she needed to tell Xavier, and what she needed to arrange first. She tried to count how many days remained until the wedding. She tried to remember what time the class began the following evening. Then they reached the red light at Gerrard Street. The car stopped, and everything in her mind stopped moving at once. Those words came back to her. Not the confession about the drink, not the $240,000, not even the receipt with the payer field left blank. It was the final sentence, whose disappearance wouldn't cause anyone to make a fuss. Lyra sat there and realized something that turned her cold. She wasn't angry at all. She kept waiting for the anger to come. She had been waiting for it since she walked out of the coffee shop, but it never came. What came instead was agreement. She agreed with Corinne. She herself had spoken almost those exact words, with her own mouth, in that room in Chestnut Hill on the first morning, when she sat before a man she didn't know and listed the facts that she had no brothers or sisters, that her father had died when she was 19, that her landlord called only on the first day of every month. She had said it calmly that day, and she had even thought herself brave for being able to say it. Now she understood that it hadn't been courage. She had simply lived with that truth for so long that it no longer hurt her. Someone had sat in a car, scrolled through a list of names, and found the exact thing she had known about herself for years. They hadn't uncovered a secret. They had merely read it aloud. The light turned green. The car moved on. Lyra raised a hand to cover her mouth, and the first sob broke through the spaces between her fingers. She cried like someone fighting not to cry, her shoulders trembling, her breath breaking into short, ragged pieces, and she folded forward until her forehead touched her knees. Bruno said nothing. He didn't ask. He simply turned off the main road onto a quiet side street with little traffic and slowed down. Lyra cried the entire way. She cried because 10 years of friendship had turned out to be nothing more than an entry on a list of people who had been ruled out. She cried because she remembered that Corinne had been the one sitting beside her in the hospital corridor until morning on the night her father died. But most of all, she cried for something else, something she couldn't put into words. That for 27 years, she had made herself smaller, had worked 3 jobs without complaining, had apologized when someone carried a plate past her face, had pressed herself against the wall whenever she walked through a hallway. And all those things together had created exactly what they needed. A woman who could disappear without making a sound. The car stopped somewhere. Bruno switched off the engine and remained still in the front seat, both hands resting on the steering wheel, his eyes facing straight ahead. He didn't offer her a tissue. He didn't say a word. He simply sat there and waited, and not once did he hurry her. 15 minutes later, Lyra sat upright. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, drew in a long breath, and looked through the window to see where she was. Bruno had parked in the riverside lot east of Fishtown, where the dead-end road ran all the way to an iron fence overlooking the water. Lyra opened the door and stepped out. She didn't ask why he had brought her there. She walked to the fence, placed both hands on the crossbar, and stood there. The wind rising from the river carried the smell of metal and engine oil. On the opposite bank, several cargo cranes stood motionless. She remained there for about half an hour. Then she heard tires rolling over the gravel behind her, a car door closing, and footsteps approaching before stopping a few paces away. Xavier said nothing for a long while. He stood beside her with both hands in the pockets of his coat, and he, too, looked out across the water. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't ask what Corinne had said. Bruno must have called him, and he must have told him enough. Lyra was the first to speak. She recounted everything from the beginning, her voice dry and clear, exactly the way she read a passage aloud to her students for the second time. She told him about Perry Lund's $240,000. She told him about Corinne refusing 3 times and the sheet of paper bearing her mother's room number. She told him about the blank payer field on the receipt. Then she told him about the 3 hours Corinne had spent sitting in her car, scrolling through her contacts, about the 4 names, and the 3 reasons she had crossed out the first 3. When she reached that part, she stopped. "She was right," Lyra said. "That's what I can't swallow. She didn't tell a single lie." Xavier continued looking out at the river. "That first morning at your house, I said almost the same thing myself," she continued. "I sat on your bed and listed all the reasons no one would come looking for me. When I finished, I even thought I sounded calm." Her hands tightened around the iron bar. "Now I understand that I was calm because I'd believed it for a long time." The wind changed direction. A barge moved very slowly through the middle of the river. "I'm not asking whether you believe it," Lyra said. "I'm only saying it aloud." Xavier turned away. He walked to the weathered wooden bench beside the fence, sat down, and rested both elbows on his knees. Seated there, he was lower than she was, and he looked up at her. "When I was 19, my father called me into his study," he said. "I've told you that part. But I haven't told you what happened afterward." Lyra turned to look at him. "For 18 years, I haven't chosen a single thing for myself," he said it calmly, without a trace of self-pity in his voice. "They put me in this position. They handed me lists of people I needed to meet. They told me whom I should marry to hold the southern docks. 8 weeks before the wedding, I still hadn't once sat down and asked myself whether I wanted it, because that question wasn't on the list." He looked down at his hands. "I thought that made me strong. Everyone else thought so too. This entire city calls me by a name that makes people fall silent, and for 18 years, I haven't made one decision for myself." Lyra said nothing. Then one morning, Xavier said, "A woman sat on my bed, white as a sheet and trembling, and refused my money." He looked up. "You were the first person in 18 years to set conditions for me without asking for anything. You gave me 3 conditions. I agreed to all 3, and that night, I sat in my study and realized I had just said yes to something no one had told me I had to say yes to." He stood. He didn't move any closer. "I'm not making you any promises," he said. "I'm not telling you I'll find whoever did this and decide what to do with them. You don't need to hear those things, and I don't want you living in a house where people make promises to one another in that kind of language." Lyra released the fence. "You said your friend was right," Xavier said. "She was right about what she knew." She looked through her contacts and saw a woman with no one standing behind her. That was all she could see. He looked directly at her. "You aren't the easiest person to lose. You're the only person I can't lose." Lyra stood motionless. She couldn't answer him. Over the past 4 weeks, someone had arranged her death in advance. Someone had counted her students. Someone had sat in a car and crossed out 3 names before choosing hers. And here, in a riverside parking lot, a man had just told her that she was the one person he couldn't bear to lose. She didn't know what to do with those words. She knew only that, for the first time in 4 weeks, the ground beneath her feet felt still. She drew in a breath, wiped away the last trace of tears with the back of her hand, and turned toward the river. "I'm going to see Corinne again," she said. Xavier tilted his head slightly. "Not to forgive her," Lyra said. "To tell her to do something." Lyra arranged to meet Corinne 3 days later, at the same coffee shop on the corner of 2nd Street and Poplar Street, at the same time in the morning, at the same table farthest inside. She arrived 15 minutes early. She placed a stack of A4 paper and a ballpoint pen on the table, and she didn't order anything to drink. Corinne arrived 7 minutes late. She looked noticeably thinner than she had the last time. She sat down, looked at the stack of paper, then looked at Lyra, and didn't ask a single question. Lyra pushed the paper toward her. She said she wasn't going to the police. She said that first, so Corinne wouldn't have to sit there wondering, but then she continued, saying that it didn't mean this was over. A woman named Maeve Kavanagh was lying in Bryn Mawr, and there were 32 names in an attendance book, and every one of those people was still within the reach of whoever had sent Corinne to do that job. This would end only when that person could no longer reach them. Corinne asked what she had to do. Lyra pointed to the paper. She said Corinne was going to write, by hand, not typed, and not dictated for someone else to write down. The date of every meeting, the location, who had said what, the amount of $240,000 and the name of the person holding the note, the date she had gone to the finance desk in Roxborough and the amount she had paid. the paper bearing Maeve's room number that they had shown her. All 3 times she had refused, written down without leaving out a single one. And the night she poured that drink, recorded exactly as it had happened, with nothing added and nothing taken away. Corinne picked up the pen, then set it down again. She said that if she wrote it all down, she would go to prison. Lyra said she might. Corinne asked what would happen to Perry. Lyra said she didn't know. Corinne asked why Lyra was doing this, why she didn't simply leave her to face whatever came. And Lyra sat quietly for a moment before answering. She said that for the past 4 years, she had stood in a basement and told people older than she was that missing something for 30 years didn't mean they had run out of chances, that there was always one right thing left for a person to do, and if she abandoned Corinne now, then she had lied to every one of them. She pushed the pen closer to Corinne. She said she didn't forgive her. She said she might never forgive her, and she wouldn't pretend otherwise. But she was giving Corinne one right thing to do, and Corinne could do it, or she could stand up and walk out of the coffee shop, and that choice belonged to her and no one else. Corinne sat motionless for a very long time. Then she pulled the stack of paper closer, opened to the first page, and began to write. She wrote for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Lyra sat across from her for those entire 2 hours and 40 minutes, and didn't say a word. When Corinne finished, she signed the bottom of every page, 11 pages in all, and added the date. Lyra folded the papers, placed them in her briefcase, then took out another sheet and handed it to Corinne. It was an application for a library card. She said that if Corinne ever needed to search for records concerning her own case, she had the right to do so, and no one was allowed to tell her otherwise. Corinne took the form, folded it into quarters, and slipped it into her coat pocket. That same afternoon, in a law office on Market Street, Xavier signed a set of transfer documents. He didn't meet Perry Lund. He had never met Perry Lund, and he had no intention of doing so. What he bought wasn't the debt itself. What he bought was the right to collect it. The Sartori family's people held the note for $240,000 through a short-term lending company registered in Delaware, and that company had a minority shareholder who needed cash. Xavier paid the full amount, paid it all at once, and paid 12% above face value so no one would have time to think of a reason to refuse. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the holder of Perry Lund's note was no longer the Sartori family. The lawyer asked whether Xavier wanted to erase the debt altogether. Xavier said no. He left the debt unchanged, left the payment schedule unchanged, and left every term exactly as it was. He changed only the name written on the paper, because if the debt disappeared, Perry Lund would tell everyone he knew, and the Sartori family would hear about it within a day. But if the debt remained exactly where it was, no one would notice anything for the next 3 months. The only thing that had changed was that, from that afternoon forward, the Sartori family no longer held anything they could use to force Corinne Baxter to do anything. That evening, Lyra placed the 11 pages on the desk in the study at Chestnut Hill. Xavier read every one of them slowly, without skipping a single page. When he finished, he said nothing about Corinne. He merely turned back to the 4th page and pointed to one line, where Corinne had written that the man who gave her the paper bearing Maeve's room number had said this wasn't about money, and that 4 weeks later, someone else would be grateful to her. Xavier asked whether Lyra had noticed that sentence. She said she had. 4 weeks from that day was the week of the scholarship gala. The person who would be grateful wasn't a member of the Sartori family. It was someone else. Someone on whose behalf the Sartori family had merely been working. Xavier folded the pages, placed one hand over them, and said that for the past 4 weeks, he had been looking for the wrong person. On Saturday evening, Lyra arrived early for class and brought along a folder of documents she intended to review during the break. Inside were several old photographs Xavier had given her the day before, pictures taken at the Delaware docks in the summer of 2008 and reprinted from his family's archives. She placed them on the teacher's desk and forgot about them. When the break came, Walt Grady walked up to ask her about a word on the worksheet, then glanced down at the desk and stopped. He placed a finger on one of the photographs. It showed a group of people standing beside a row of shipping containers, taken from a slight angle, with 4 people in the frame and a black car parked behind them. Walt wasn't looking at the 4 people standing there. He was looking at the car. "I know this guy," he said. Lyra pulled the photograph closer. Through the window, which had been lowered halfway, a man could be seen sitting in the back seat. Only half of his face was visible, and the printed image wasn't clear. She asked Walt if he was certain. Walt sat down in the chair beside the teacher's desk and said he was. He explained it in the voice of a man who had been forced to explain the same thing many times in his life. He had worked at the docks for 31 years, and throughout those 31 years, he couldn't read a single line on the shift board, couldn't read the names on a shipping manifest, and couldn't read the signs. He had to remember things another way. He remembered faces. He remembered voices. He remembered the way people walked and the way they held a cigarette. He said that anyone who couldn't read had to remember 10 times as much as everyone else, or they wouldn't survive. He pointed to the man in the car and said he had seen him at the docks 3 times, and all 3 times, the man had remained inside the vehicle. The last time had been in the summer of 2008, on a hot afternoon, while Walt was waiting for the next shift. The car had been parked on the service road behind warehouse number 7. There were 2 men inside. The man in the back seat was this one. Walt recognized the man sitting beside the driver. He was connected to the Sartori family, and Walt had seen him many times around the southern loading area. The 2 men sat in the car for about 15 minutes, then drove away. Lyra asked if he remembered the date. Walt said he didn't, but he remembered that warehouse number 7 exploded 2 days later, because everyone at the docks talked about it for months, and because that day he had been forced to walk around 3 entire rows to reach the time clock. Lyra picked up the photograph. She asked Walt the name of the man in the car. Walt said he didn't know it. He had never heard anyone call the man by name. He only knew his face. The class ended at 9:10. The following morning, Lyra arrived at the Free Library of Philadelphia on Vine Street just as it opened. She didn't tell Xavier. Bruno went with her, and he sat at a table 2 rows away. She presented her library card at the research desk and asked to use a computer in the reference section. She did exactly what she always taught in class, following the steps in the proper order. Step 1. Find the newspaper article. She entered the digital archives of the Philadelphia Inquirer, narrowed the dates to August of 2008, and searched the keywords warehouse, Delaware docks, fire, and explosion. She found 4 articles. The longest had been published on August 16th and included the name of the company leasing the warehouse, the name of the fire department spokesperson, and 1 sentence stating that the investigation was continuing. Step 2. Find the original record. She wrote down the incident number printed in the article, then submitted a request for a copy of the Philadelphia Fire Department's incident report. It was a public record. An employee told her to complete a form and wait. The copy arrived 4 business days later. Step 3. Read the appendices carefully. The report was 19 pages long. The first 15 pages contained everything Xavier had already told her: old pipes, old electrical systems, and the conclusion that it had been an accident. But on page 17 of the appendix was a list no newspaper article had mentioned, a record of the vehicles logged through the Eastern Gate checkpoint during the 7 days before the incident, provided to investigators by the Port Authority. The list included license plate numbers, dates, arrival times, and departure times. Lyra worked her way down from the top. On August 12th, a vehicle entered at 2:21 in the afternoon and left at 2:39, 18 minutes. She wrote down the license plate number. Step 4. Trace the plate. She searched Pennsylvania's public business registration records and found a small transportation company that had been dissolved in 2013. She opened the list of legal representatives. There were 2 names. She didn't recognize the first. The second was a name she had heard 3 times in the house at Chestnut Hill, always mentioned only in passing, the way people referred to someone who had been there for so long that no one noticed him anymore. Arturo Coletti. Lyra reached Chestnut Hill at nearly 7 o'clock that evening, a folder tucked beneath her arm, while the phone in her coat pocket was still recording. She had turned it on when she left the library that afternoon so she could read the appendix aloud again, just as she did every Tuesday evening for Doreen, and she had forgotten to turn it off. She went upstairs, opened the door to the study, and stopped on the threshold. The desk lamp was on. Someone was already sitting in the chair across from Xavier's desk. Arturo Coletti was 61, thin, with silver hair combed straight back, and he was pouring liquor into 2 glasses. He pushed one of them toward the empty chair on the other side of the desk. "Just getting back from the library, teacher," he said. Lyra didn't step inside. Artie smiled and told her to sit down, that he didn't mean to frighten her, that he had sent Bruno downstairs on an errand, and that he needed only 15 minutes. He spoke in the voice of a kindly uncle, the sort of voice one used to ask after an elderly relative's health at a family memorial gathering. Lyra sat down. She placed the folder on her lap and didn't open it. Artie said he knew she had gone to the library 3 times in 10 days. He knew she had filed a request for a copy of the incident report. He knew that copy had arrived on Thursday. He said he wasn't angry, that he actually found it very interesting, because in 18 years, no one had ever thought to read the appendix. People read only the conclusion. Conclusions were always brief, and they were always comforting. Lyra asked what he intended to do. Artie said he didn't intend to do anything to her. He made that very clear, then added that she needed to understand he needed her alive, needed her healthy, and needed her present at the wedding. Then he took a sip of his drink and told her why. He said everyone assumed this would end with guns. The Sartori family assumed it. Bianca assumed it. Even Xavier had prepared for it. But guns were messy and expensive, and they turned people into martyrs. He said he had been meeting with the federal prosecutor's office once a month since 2022, and as of that day, he had provided information 47 times. He stated the number as calmly as a man reciting his own age. He said the only thing they were still missing was an occasion when both families would be gathered inside the same building, with a guest list, photographs, a seating chart, and a ceremony recorded on paper. The wedding would give them all of that in a single afternoon. He said Xavier wouldn't die. Xavier would spend the rest of his life in prison, and that was a much cleaner outcome. Lyra asked what would happen afterward. Artie turned the glass slowly in his hand and said that afterward, the chair would be empty, and there would be no one else in that house old enough to sit in it except him. He said he had waited 18 years. Lyra remained silent. She asked why. Artie set his glass on the desk. He said his son's name, Nico. He said Nico had died in 2006, at 20 years old, in a war Xavier's father had started, and then ended 4 months later with a telephone call. He said that when Nico died, Cosimo Orsini called his home. The call lasted 1 minute and 10 seconds. Afterward, Cosimo sent flowers. He said he still had the card. Then Artie told her the rest, and he told it in that same kindly voice from beginning to end. He said that 2 years later, at the Delaware docks, there was an old pipeline and an old electrical system, and old things failed very easily, and no one went searching for the cause when something had already been on the verge of failing. He said Tobia Orsini had been a capable young man, truly capable, and that was precisely why he couldn't be allowed to sit in that chair. He said he didn't need to kill the entire family. He only needed to replace the man in the chair with a 19-year-old boy studying accounting, a boy who would need someone to guide him for the next 10 years. Artie paused. Then he said that was where he had miscalculated. The boy had grown harder than he expected, and much faster than he expected, and by the 8th year, he no longer asked for Artie's advice. Lyra asked why he was telling her all of this. Artie stood, fastened the button of his suit jacket, and smiled. He said he was telling her because there was nothing she could do. He said she didn't have a lawyer, didn't have anyone standing behind her, and didn't have a name people were forced to listen to. He said she had already proved that last month, when someone had chosen her, and no one had made a fuss. He reached the door, then stopped and looked back. They chose you because they thought you were power possessed by no one, he said cold-headedly. And you have no power to stop what happens next. The door closed. Lyra sat motionless. Then she slipped a hand into her coat pocket, touched the phone, and saw that the indicator light was still glowing. The sky was clear on the day of the wedding. Guests began arriving at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. 200 people, with no one under 18 on the list. The Sartori family sat on the left. The Orsini family sat on the right. Lyra stood in the second-floor hallway and looked down through the window. She had known everything for 4 days. She hadn't slept in 4 days. Xavier knew. They had listened to the recording 3 times. The family attorney said it couldn't be used in court. Pennsylvania required the consent of both parties. The recording could point the way. It couldn't stand on its own. At 4 o'clock, the music began. Lyra walked downstairs. She moved slowly. She looked straight ahead. She smiled at those who smiled at her. She counted her steps so she wouldn't think about anything else. Artie stood near the 3rd row of chairs. He adjusted his cuff. He nodded to her. She nodded back. In the front row on the Orsini side, Graziella sat motionless. She wore dark clothing. Her handbag rested on her lap. Beside her sat a woman of about 50, whom Lyra had never seen before. No one introduced her. No one asked. No one paid any attention to the 2 women sitting beside each other in the front row. The officiant began to speak. Xavier stood to Lyra's right. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching Artie. Artie raised a hand and touched his cufflink. Twice. Then he lowered his hand. At the back of the room, 3 men in dark suits entered. No one ran. No one shouted. The woman beside Graziella rose. She walked directly into the center aisle. She took out an identification card and held it up. Adele Prescott, United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. Everyone in the room turned. Artie turned as well. He smiled. He took one step toward her. Then he stopped. Because she wasn't looking at him. She wasn't looking at Xavier. She turned to Graziella and gave a single nod. Graziella stood. She opened her handbag. She took out a thick stack of papers held inside a blue folder, carefully labeled. She handed it to Adele Prescott. Then she turned to Artie. She spoke in an ordinary voice. She said she had begun keeping records 3 years earlier. She said that at first, she hadn't understood anything. She had only seen that he was lying. She said she had worked as a nurse for 9 years in the emergency department at St. Agnes Hospital, on the night shift. And there, people learned one thing: to watch a person's face instead of listening to their mouth. She said he had lied about the telephone call in March of 2023. She said he had lied about the trip to Baltimore. She said he had revealed himself 4 times in 3 years, and each time, she had written down the date, the hour, and his exact words. She said she had given everything to her private attorney 14 months earlier. Artie was no longer smiling. He said she was an old woman. Graziella nodded. She said that was true, and that was why this had worked. She said that for 30 years, no one in that family had even remembered what she once did for a living. She said he had eaten Sunday dinner at her table 100 times, and had never once lowered his voice when she walked past. Adele Prescott named 3 witnesses. The first was Corinne Baxter, whose 11-page handwritten statement had been submitted. The second was Walter Grady, a direct witness whose statement had been taken on Tuesday. The third was Graziella Orsini. Artie reached inside his suit jacket, pulling out a concealed pistol and aiming directly at Xavier. Bruno lunged forward, slamming his weight into Artie's arm just as he pulled the trigger. There was a gunshot. Only one. The bullet grazed Xavier's shoulder, and the sound was sharp and dry as it echoed against the high ceiling. 200 people screamed at once. Chairs toppled over. Somewhere in the back, glass shattered. Lyra was shoved to the floor. She didn't know who had pushed her. She heard people running. She heard a man shouting. Then it stopped. She lifted her head. Artie was lying face down. 2 men were pinning him to the floor. Handcuffs snapped shut with a metallic click. Bruno was on his knees. He was gripping Xavier's shoulder. Xavier was still standing. Then he sat down on the step. Lyra crawled toward him. She placed both hands on his chest. He said he was all right. He said it twice. Graziella reached him before any of the family's men did. She knelt, pushed Bruno's hand aside, and pressed her palm where pressure needed to be applied. She gave orders to the 3 large men surrounding her, one at a time, and all 3 did exactly as she said. Her hands didn't tremble. On the other side of the room, Aldo Sartori rose to his feet. He watched as Artie was dragged toward the door. He looked at Adele Prescott. Then he picked up his cane and walked out without saying a word to anyone, and his men followed him. The ceremony hadn't yet reached the vows. Nothing had been signed. Xavier woke the following morning at Lankenau Hospital, his left shoulder wrapped in bandages and an intravenous needle in his right arm. The bullet had passed through the soft tissue without touching the bone. The doctor said he was lucky. Graziella had sat in the chair beside his bed all night and refused to let anyone relieve her. Lyra arrived at 9 o'clock. She stood at the foot of the bed. Xavier told her to open the drawer of the bedside table. Inside was a sheet of paper folded in half. The 3-month agreement she had read and accepted in the room at Chestnut Hill on that first morning. He said he had asked Bruno to bring it over the night before. He said there were still 11 days left in the 3 months, but it was over now, and he had kept his word. He told her she was free. Lyra picked up the paper. She read it again from beginning to end, slowly, as though reading an assignment aloud before a class. Then she tore it in half, folded it, tore it once more, and placed the pieces on the table beside the glass of water. She said she was staying, not because of the agreement, but because she chose to. Xavier didn't answer. He simply reached out his right hand, and she took it. Leading the family out of the underworld wasn't something that happened in a week, and it bore no resemblance to a miracle. It began with tedious things. The first 3 months were spent on audits. Xavier sat with 2 attorneys and a chief accountant, opened every account, every warehouse lease, every transportation company registered in Delaware, and separated them into 2 columns. The first column contained what was legal and could be kept. The second contained what had to be shut down. The second column was much longer. 7 people left the Orsini family during those 4 months, and 3 of them left in anger. Some money could never be recovered. One evening, Xavier sat in the study until 3 o'clock in the morning because of a decision that cost 40 people their jobs, and he told no one how long he had remained there. The accounting degree he had abandoned at 19 finally found its purpose. Arturo Coletti received a prison sentence. The Sartori family lost its allies and quietly withdrew from the southern docks. Corinne Baxter went to court and received a reduced sentence because of her voluntary testimony. She wrote to Lyra 3 times. Lyra read all 3 letters and answered one. 6 months later, an adult literacy center opened on Frankfurt Avenue, 2 blocks from the old church basement, inside a single-story building with 12 classrooms and a computer room containing 6 computers. A name was mounted on the outside wall: the Tobia Orsini Center. The opening ceremony was held at 10 o'clock on Saturday morning. Walt Grady gave the speech. He walked to the podium, placed his paper before him, and read. No one read it for him. No one stood beside him to offer reminders. He read all 4 paragraphs in 4 minutes, stumbling twice. And both times, he stopped, drew a breath, then continued from the place where he had stumbled. In the final paragraph, he said that for 31 years, he had signed his name with a single letter, and that morning, he had signed the guest book with his full name. The entire room rose to its feet. In the front row, Maeve Kavanagh applauded with everyone else. She didn't know what day it was, and she didn't remember that the woman standing in the corner wiping her eyes was her daughter, but she applauded, then turned to the person beside her and said that the old man up there had read beautifully. Graziella sat beside her. She reached out and took Lyra's hand, holding it until the applause had completely faded. There is one truth this story leaves behind. People often measure the worth of a human being by things that are easy to count, by how much money they earn in a year, by their title, by how much they can remember, or by whether anyone comes looking when they disappear. But a poor woman teaching people to read in a basement, a 63-year-old man who had spent his entire life unable to read, and an elderly woman whose own family had forgotten what work she once did, those 3 people whom others considered insignificant accomplished what power and money never could. No one is expendable. No one is so small that they can't change something. And the surest way to lose a human being is to decide beforehand that they don't matter. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel to hear more meaningful stories every day. Your like and share will help this story reach more people. And what about you? What do you think of this story? And is there someone in your life who is being treated as though they don't matter when, in truth, they matter deeply? Please leave a comment below. We sincerely want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest place in your heart. We wish every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.